Tipping is out of control, and it's gotten so bad that many people in the United States have stopped tipping altogether. Oh, stick around because this story is crazy. Because in the United States, tipping has turned into a financial form of emotional blackmail, perpetuated by larger and larger companies that have no business even asking for tips. But they all want to get in on this cash grab. Because believe it or not, companies like Walmart have even been test piloting requests for tips at self-checkout kiosks in their stores. Like no one's even doing work to be tipped. You bag your own stuff. You are doing all of the work, and then Walmart asks you to give them money for the pleasure of doing all of that. But this twisted state of where tipping is right now is just the tip of the iceberg. And tipping in 2023 might not be healthy for the economy or society at all. But in order to understand where we are, we gotta go back in time to the beginning and origins of tipping in the United States. And it all began in the early 1800s when wealthy Americans traveled to Europe. And it's there that they were introduced to the concept. Tipping originated in Europe as an exchange of money from master to serf, where masters would reward their servants with a little bit of extra coin for doing a good job at their job. And when wealthy Americans on vacation to Europe who observed this returned back to the United States, they brought this tradition of tipping with them as a flex.
Ah, yes, excellent work. Buy yourself something nice, peasant.
When this started in the early 1800s in the United States, it was seen as insulting. It was this thing that rich people did to flex on people lower than them, and it was done in bad taste. Sort of in the same way that rich people today post pictures on social media of them on their private jets, while at the same time lecturing us commoners about climate change. Everybody knows that it's cringe except for them. And it was the same thing with tipping back in the day. But despite its negative connotation, there's a reason that tipping took off in the 1800s. Because in 1863, a major change to the American economy made tipping the perfect loophole for businesses to continue saving on labor and avoid change. Because when the 13th Amendment was passed, millions of former slaves entered a workforce where opportunities were scarce to begin with, and former slave owners and their associates who didn't pay these people during the age of slavery weren't about to start paying them fairly now. So in an effort to quietly continue the practice of slavery, many institutions and businesses hired former slaves with ridiculously low wages plus the opportunity to accept tips. And this practice grew in popularity in the South until pretty soon the entire service industry jumped on the bandwagon, as businesses saw an opportunity to normalize extremely low wages for low-level positions with the expectation that the difference in these very low wages would be subsidized by you, the consumer, in the form of tips. And that tradition stuck. It's spread. And flash forward a few hundred years, now when we all go out to eat, we all know that our waiter or waitress isn't being paid well by their employer, and it's up to us to make sure that they get to eat. It's up to us as patrons to make sure that financial ends meet for the person who's waiting on our table. So unless you have exceptionally bad service and you actually see somebody spit into your food, you're gonna tip them. And that practice can be traced all the way back to the South in the mid-1800s, where former slave owners tried desperately to cling to free and cheap labor. And in 2023, businesses are still doing this, because the federal minimum wage for restaurant employees nationwide is only $2.13 per hour. Now, some states have passed laws to make this number higher, but many restaurants don't pay their staff livable wages. But it's allowed because those wages are supposed to be brought up by tips left by patrons. And we've all been conditioned to pay into this system. And now that it's a habit that's been ingrained for generations, more big businesses are tapping into Americans' tendency to leave tips, asking for tips when there is zero reason to leave one. I personally have been asked to tip for buying a bottle of water from my local sandwich shop. Like, that's the only thing I bought. I bought a bottle of bottled water, the guy reached behind him, handed it to me, and then spun the little iPad around to ask me a couple of questions. Like, what are we doing here? And now that everyone is asking for tips for every service that's rendered in our economy, it's becoming really easy to just not tip anywhere. Because Americans are officially in a state of max tip fatigue. And as more people move away from tipping, it hurts the people who need tips the most. The people waiting tables who are getting paid less than minimum wage by their employer. And the most frustrating thing about all of this is if you refuse to tip in 2023, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a terrible human being, because tipping feels so shady in so many circumstances. Because unless you can put hard cash into the physical hand of the person who helped you, there's no knowing whether or not that money is actually going to make it to them. If you tip on a digital screen, you have no idea whether or not the business itself is just taking that money for themselves. Just like Amazon got caught doing back in 2015. Almost a decade ago, Amazon had a program called Flex that allowed customers to leave tips for their drivers, and everybody loves their Amazon drivers. So people tipped, and they tipped generously. But those drivers didn't get the money because Amazon asked for those tips through their app, and the drivers had no way of knowing they were getting tipped in the first place. And Amazon kept $62 million that was intended for drivers, and they just use it for themselves. So when you're at your local restaurant and your favorite server gives you your food and they flip the little screen around to ask you a few questions, there's no way of knowing whether or not that person is actually getting the money that you intend for them unless you have physical cash. And all of this is why Americans are abandoning tipping. And what this means for the service industry as a whole is anybody's guess. So the question is this: when every single business out there is asking for tips, when is it appropriate to leave one? And when is it better to just hold on to your hard-earned money? What do you think?